Mark Rust was the polite man next door, the one who always waved to Mrs. Ellison as she walked her dog and helped young David Jenkins fix his bike when the chain slipped. To the residents of Willow Creek, he was a quiet, unassuming neighbor. But to Amanda Carson, Jessica Fields, and over a dozen other women whose names would later fill missing persons reports, Mark Rust was something far more sinister, a predator hiding in plain sight. Mark Rust was the kind of neighbor you'd never notice unless you were looking for him. He lived alone in a modest, white-painted house with blue shutters at the end of Maple Street in the quiet town of Willow Creek. The lawn was always meticulously trimmed, the flower beds neat and vibrant, and the porch spotless, as though he spent hours ensuring everything appeared perfect. People in town would describe him as polite but distant. He waved when he passed you on the street, nodded courteously at the grocery store, and occasionally exchanged pleasantries with the mailman. But beyond those surface-level interactions, Mark was a mystery. Willow Creek was the type of place where everyone knew everyone else, or at least thought they did. The town had its share of gossip and speculation, but Mark rarely featured in those conversations. He wasn't married, had no close friends, and didn't seem interested in forming connections. Most chalked it up to shyness or a preference for solitude. In a town where quiet was normal, his reclusive nature didn't raise eyebrows. For years, strange disappearances cast a shadow over the town. It started with tourists, young women on road trips who never checked out of their motels or left abandoned cars by the highway. Then, a few locals vanished, women with no close family or strong ties to Willow Creek. The disappearances became a grim pattern, one that unsettled the tight-knit community. People locked their doors earlier, avoided walking alone at night, and whispered theories in hushed tones. Still, no one thought to look toward the quiet man at the end of Maple Street. Mark played his part perfectly. He volunteered at the local food bank a few times a year, helped an elderly neighbor carry groceries, and once spent an afternoon fixing a broken fence for the widow next door. These small gestures reinforced his image as a harmless, albeit private individual. But behind closed doors, Mark was a man consumed by darkness. Beneath his picturesque home was a secret that no one in Willow Creek could have imagined. Hidden behind a heavy bookcase in his basement was a soundproof room that Mark had spent years constructing. The walls were lined with padded insulation, and the floor was covered in a material that absorbed every sound. It was in this room that Mark indulged the horrific urges he had carefully hidden from the world. Mark's meticulous nature extended to every aspect of his double life. He planned each abduction with precision, targeting women who wouldn't be missed or whose absence could be easily explained. He studied their routines, observing them from a distance until he knew their habits better than they did. His ability to blend into the background made him virtually invisible, a phantom who left no trace. No one in Willow Creek could have imagined the truth. To them, Mark Rust was just another quiet neighbor, a man who lived his life without bothering anyone. But beneath the surface of his ordinary facade lay the chilling mind of a predator, patiently crafting a web of horrors that would one day unravel, exposing the dark truth hiding in plain sight. The disappearances that plagued Willow Creek were more than random acts of violence. They followed a pattern so subtle that it took years for anyone to notice. The victims were always women, usually between the ages of 20 and 35, and they were always last seen near the same stretch of highway just outside of town. This isolated road, surrounded by dense forests, was both a lifeline and a dead end. It connected the town to the outside world, but also offered the perfect cover for someone who wanted to vanish, or make someone else vanish. Mark Rust had chosen this location deliberately. He spent countless hours driving along the highway, studying the area until he knew every curve, every hidden pull-off, and every blind spot. He understood that the remoteness of the road worked in his favor. Cars rarely passed by after dark, and the tall trees shielded his movements from prying eyes. To him, the highway was a hunting ground, a place where he could operate without interruption. Mark's ability to evade detection wasn't just a matter of luck. It was the result of meticulous planning. He approached each victim with the precision of a predator stalking prey. He watched them from a distance, learning their routines and identifying their vulnerabilities. He took note of when they were alone, when they let their guard down, and when they were most likely to make a mistake. Once he had chosen his target, Mark struck with calculated efficiency. He used a ruse that played on the innate trust people have in seemingly harmless situations. Sometimes it was a fake plea for help, a flat tire or a broken down vehicle. Other times, he simply waited until the opportunity presented itself, relying on his ability to blend into the background. His victims rarely saw him coming, and by the time they realized something was wrong, it was too late. The lack of evidence left behind at each scene frustrated investigators. There were no witnesses, no DNA, no stray fibers or tire tracks to follow. It was as though the women had simply vanished into thin air. The police conducted extensive searches, canvassed neighborhoods, and interviewed anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. But every lead ended in a dead end, leaving the community in a state of perpetual unease. Despite the growing fear, Mark continued his spree, adapting his methods as law enforcement closed in on certain areas. He expanded his range, targeting nearby towns and cities to throw off suspicion. To an outsider, his life appeared unchanged. He still tended to his garden, waved at his neighbors, and went about his business as though nothing was amiss. But behind the facade, he was carefully orchestrating a campaign of terror that spanned miles and claimed countless lives. What truly set Mark apart was his need to document his crimes. In a hidden room beneath his house, he kept journals filled with detailed accounts of his actions. He referred to the women he abducted as projects, meticulously recording every detail of their lives before and after he took them. For Mark, this wasn't just about the act of killing. It was about control, power, and the perverse satisfaction of turning his victims into stories only he could tell. The pattern of disappearances might have gone unnoticed forever, if not for a small mistake that Mark made, one that would ultimately unravel the dark web he had spent years weaving. But for now, he remained invisible, a phantom lurking in the shadows of a seemingly ordinary life. Mark Rust's carefully constructed facade began to crumble with a single, seemingly minor oversight. On a cold November evening, he was driving through a neighboring town when a police officer pulled him over for a broken taillight. It was a routine stop, something Mark should have been able to handle with his usual calm demeanor. But this time, his composure faltered. As the officer approached the car, Mark appeared nervous, his hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly. The officer noticed his unease and decided to take a closer look. While running Mark's license and registration, he spotted something unusual in the passenger seat: a worn leather wallet, partially tucked under a blanket. When asked about it, Mark hesitated before claiming he had found it on the side of the road earlier that day. The officer's curiosity was piqued, and he decided to investigate further. He asked Mark to step out of the car and open the wallet, discovering an ID belonging to a young woman who had been reported missing just weeks earlier. Though it wasn't enough to make an arrest, the discovery raised significant red flags. Mark's name was entered into the police database, and an investigation into his activities quietly began. Authorities began piecing together information about Mark's life: his reclusive nature, his lack of close relationships, and his habit of traveling to nearby towns all painted a picture of someone who might be hiding something. Investigators decided to obtain a search warrant for his property, hoping to uncover any evidence that might link him to the missing woman. When officers arrived at Mark's home, they were struck by its pristine appearance. Every surface was spotless, every item meticulously arranged. It was almost unnaturally clean, as though Mark had gone to great lengths to erase any trace of wrongdoing. The initial search yielded nothing unusual, frustrating the team. But then one of the officers noticed a faint crack in the wall of the basement, hidden behind a stack of boxes. What they discovered behind that wall would horrify even the most seasoned investigators. Behind a sliding panel, they found a soundproof room filled with evidence of Mark's crimes. Personal belongings from multiple victims were carefully stored in labeled boxes. Journals lined the shelves, each one detailing the gruesome fate of a different woman. There were photographs, sketches, and maps, each meticulously documenting the locations where the victims had been taken or buried. The most damning piece of evidence was a map pinned to the wall, marked with red dots representing the locations of Mark's crimes. The pattern revealed the horrifying extent of his activities, spanning multiple states and claiming the lives of over a dozen women. The discovery shocked the investigators, who realized they had uncovered the work of a methodical and calculating killer. Mark Rust had managed to evade detection for years, but his reign of terror was finally coming to an end. The break in the case not only revealed the truth about the disappearances, but also marked the beginning of the process to bring justice to his victims and their families. The arrest of Mark Rust sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. News outlets across the country picked up the story of the unassuming man from Willow Creek who had secretly lived a double life as a serial killer. As the public grappled with the horrors uncovered in his basement, psychologists and criminal profilers delved into his mind to understand what had driven him to commit such heinous acts. What they found was as disturbing as the crimes themselves. Mark Rust was diagnosed with multiple personality disorders, including malignant narcissism and antisocial personality disorder. He exhibited traits of a sociopath, completely devoid of empathy or remorse. His journals, which provided an unnervingly detailed account of his crimes, became a crucial window into his psyche. He wrote about his victims with clinical detachment, referring to them not as people, but as projects or subjects. To Mark, they were not individuals with lives and families, but objects to be manipulated and controlled. The journals revealed the depth of his delusions. Mark believed he was superior to those around him, seeing himself as an artist and his crimes as his masterpieces. He described each abduction and murder in painstaking detail, noting how he tailored his approach to fit each victim. He wrote of the satisfaction he felt in outsmarting his victims, law enforcement, and society as a whole. His meticulous planning and ability to evade detection for years only fed his sense of invincibility. But beneath the carefully crafted exterior of control lay a fractured man, driven by a profound need for dominance. Mark's writings also exposed his fixation on power dynamics, where every interaction, every move was calculated to establish his authority over his victims. This obsession extended beyond the physical acts of his crimes. It was about the mental control he exerted, the fear he instilled, and the complete dependency he forced upon his victims before ending their lives. Psychologists noted the chilling precision with which he documented his emotions, or lack thereof. He described the act of killing in terms that were disturbingly mundane, as though it were an everyday task. Yet, his writings also hinted at a desire for recognition. Mark viewed himself as a misunderstood genius whose actions were too complex for ordinary minds to comprehend. He seemed almost eager for the world to know the extent of his crimes, as if being caught was part of his twisted plan for immortality. Investigators and profilers also noted that Mark's behavior in custody mirrored his writings. He was calm, articulate, and eerily cooperative. He spoke about his crimes without hesitation, as though recounting a series of mundane events. When asked why he committed these acts, his response was chillingly simple: because he could. Mark's lack of remorse became a focal point of the trial. His cold, detached demeanor in court served as a stark reminder of the darkness that had consumed him. For the families of the victims, it was a painful acknowledgement that they would never receive an apology or explanation that could bring closure. Instead, they were left to grapple with the horrifying reality of a man who saw their loved ones as nothing more than objects in his depraved game. The trial of Mark Rust was one of the most sensational legal proceedings in recent history. The courtroom was packed with journalists, spectators, and the families of his victims, all seeking answers to the horrors that had plagued their lives. The evidence presented against Mark was overwhelming, from the items found in his hidden basement to the detailed confessions documented in his journals. His defense team attempted to argue insanity, claiming he was not in control of his actions. But the cold and calculated nature of his crimes made it clear that Mark had full awareness of what he was doing. The prosecution painted a chilling picture of a man who had lived two lives. On the surface, Mark was the quiet, helpful neighbor. the man who kept his house pristine and appeared to lead an ordinary existence. But beneath that facade was a predator who meticulously planned and executed a series of abductions and murders, leaving behind a trail of devastation that spanned years. His complete lack of remorse, evident in his courtroom demeanor, only solidified the jury's verdict. After weeks of testimony, the jury found Mark Rust guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never again walk free. The families of the victims wept openly as the sentence was read, a small measure of justice for the unimaginable losses they had endured. For many, however, the pain of losing their loved ones would never fade. Even behind bars, Mark continued to unsettle those around him. He seemed to revel in his infamy, granting interviews to journalists and writing letters to anyone willing to read them. In these correspondences, he described himself as misunderstood, a man whose work had been misinterpreted. He even attempted to sell the rights to his story, a move that was quickly blocked by authorities under laws preventing criminals from profiting from their crimes. Despite being silenced in the public sphere, Mark's case continued to haunt the nation. True crime documentaries, podcasts, and books dissected every detail, attempting to make sense of his motivations and the depths of his depravity. For the town of Willow Creek, the scars ran even deeper. The once quiet community became synonymous with Mark Rust's crimes, its name forever tied to his dark legacy. Efforts were made to rebuild the community's image. Memorials were erected in honor of the victims, and local leaders worked to restore a sense of safety and normalcy. But for those who had lived through the nightmare, the memories were inescapable. The homes and streets of Willow Creek bore silent witness to the years of fear and tragedy, a stark reminder of the darkness that had lurked among them. Mark Rust's story became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of the evil that can hide behind an ordinary facade. His ability to blend into the fabric of society, evading detection for so long, left an indelible mark on law enforcement and criminal profiling. Though justice was served, the echoes of his actions lingered, a chilling testament to the devastating impact of his crimes.